Green.
All right. Testing. Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our automated data governance session. Before we get into the actual meat of the content, I'm just flashing this forward-looking statement in front of you. All of the content that we're talking about today is based on our current thinking, but that is subject to change. Nevertheless, we're super excited to go over all the features that we're talking about that are in preview. And yeah, let's get into it. So some of you may have attended Zeashan and my session last year, but I just want to go ahead and reintroduce ourselves. So I'm Kristen. I'm a product manager here on the Unity Catalog team. I currently focus on governance and discovery-related experiences specific to UC. I've worked in the industry for around 5 years, and almost all of those years have been focused on governance experiences.
I'm Zeashan. I am an engineer and an architect who turned to the dark side and joined PM. And I work on our catalog governance and security products here at Databricks. I've been working with Databricks for a long time, many years with Spark, and I have a lot of experience in terms of building really scalable platforms and companies. So it's nice to be here and see all of you again.
Definitely. Okay, so before I hand things off to Zeashan to kind of kick us off with content, I do want to quickly go over what's on the menu for today. So first, we're going to talk about why scaling data governance is hard, probably something that a lot of you think about all the time. Second, we're going to go over how can we actually scale governance with automation. Third, we're going to introduce our Governance Hub, which is a new feature which we're focusing on specific to data governance. Fourth, we'll walk through a quick demo to kind of bring all these different features together. And then finally, I want to touch on where we're headed next. So this is really meant to give kind of a bite-sized idea of what we have to offer today. We want to give you some perspective into what we think are higher priority items for us on the roadmap. So I can hand this over to you to kick us off.
All right, so I feel like this is one of those no kidding Zeashan statements, right? Scaling data governance is obviously very hard. And I think there's a lot of good reasons for this, right? So if you think about what data governance traditionally means, right? Practice of ensuring that your data is accurate, secure, accessible, et cetera. And you tend to do this by setting things like rules, roles, processes, in the form of access control, right? For how data is classified, used, protected. And this works, right? When data volumes are small and complexity is low. But the reality, right? I tried to create a slide with the most chaotic looking pictures that I could imagine. But the reality is that we have a lot of challenges if we think about modern data, right? We've got a lot more users, especially with the Lakehouse, and the ability to be able to give insights to more users in the enterprise and more business users requiring access to data than perhaps did not before. We also have significantly more complex requirements around compliance. So things are a lot easier. Things were a lot easier a long time ago when nobody really understood what data is and what it meant to have access to various types of data, whether personal or otherwise. And now we have a lot of compliance requirements to dictate how we can work with data, what we can use it for. We also have all these, because we have all this data and now our executive teams really realize this data has significant value. They want to make it available, right? So we have requirements for things like better metadata to improve our search discovery experiences. And then largely, there's also all sorts of other complexities, right? Data volume and velocity is increasing, right? Different types of data exist, right? You have all these other organizational problems that start coming up, right? Things like data silos and you have a resistance to change in most of your organization, right? As you kind of start to adopt a more data-forward attitude. So reality is that there's a whole lot of challenges in the traditional governance models that we have. They just don't really keep up with Lakehouse scale as that complexity increases. So some common challenges we hear, and I'm kind of indexing on some of these because they're sort of easy to talk about, and I'm willing to bet that a lot of you run into these problems, and that you have bottleneck platform teams. So if you're a platform team, I'm sure that you feel pressure to manage things like permissions and data usage. Your teams are not necessarily always familiar with what are the most best use cases for data as kind of exists in your organization. They're not domain experts, right? They're platform teams, right? They know how to provide services to the domain data teams, but they're not necessarily the arbiters of that data themselves. And this obviously leads to things like incorrect policies being applied, sensitive data being overexposed or very locked down. It's very common when we talk to customers, nobody actually knows who owns what, right? This is I've talked to so many customers where they're I just don't know who owns this data. I don't even know if we have it. We're going to try to ETL it again. And what ends up happening is you end up with six different sources, six different copies of the same data from the same source, because you didn't know that somebody had already created a pipeline and a job and manages that data to begin with, right? And you have all these other weird scenarios where like the practitioners don't even know who they're supposed to request access to, right? So things like the responsibilities around managing metadata and access in general, right, as organizations become more data mature, are unclear. And then you also have all these scenarios where you might have unmaintained assets, right? So it's really hard to figure all this stuff out, and we totally understand that in talking with a lot of you. We also hear that things like default policies don't reflect actual usage. So for example, users are not necessarily empowered to be able to access data that they need by default, right? So things like ad hoc requests become the norm. And that's a reasonable way to do business, right? Like, hey, I need to request access to something, let me go request access to something. But sometimes it's easier to just have the access required based on your appropriate role. And when you don't have those kinds of organizational structures in your enterprise, like what ends up happening is you end up with decreased communication around what those roles and those requirements are, and that kind of leads to a lack of clarity in terms of how should I set up my access control, which of course creates the complexity problem that we're talking about. So there's some reasons for this, right? Like there are wildly different viewpoints on what data culture should look like, and every organization is very different. Now I'm kind of putting up here like a polar opposite, right versus left view of what data cultures look like at certain organizations. On the left-hand side, you've got this structured setup and control sharing, right? Where you might have a single data producer possibly, but you might have many. But you most certainly have centralized data access management, right? And you have data sets that need protection. You need things like exclusive access. You need fine-grained permission models. And that's the left hand. That's the, I'm very structured and I have a very controlled setup. And then you've got the right-hand side, which is not necessarily a data mesh, but more of a free-for-all with some guardrails, right? Where data producers are free to share to other users in the organization. You've got things like shared and scratch spaces. Cross-team collaboration is at an all-time high. But you've got some, as I said, some reasonable guardrails. But the reality is, in talking to most customers, they're neither left and they're neither right? Like these are ideologies effectively that are never fully implemented because they're almost always domain-based, right? So like you might have a particular domain where you can be a free-for-all, and you might have a particular domain where you have to have structured and control sharing because the data and the compliance requirements are too high. And the reality is that you end up with a fragmented culture, and this is a very common story that we hear from a lot of customers. So how do you address these challenges? Well, I mean, things like your company data culture or your compliance requirements will dictate your organizational model. And of course, as I said, that'll vary domain to domain. And I think that is a tension that we hear from customers all the time. And I can tell you, like, everybody else has the same problem. So you're not unique in that sense. And you're in like company. And I would say this, that if teams actually own or are incented to create data, and data can be freely shared, then we should make it freely shareable. However, if you have things like compliance requirements that are like super, super high, as I mentioned before, then you should consider things like centralized access control patterns. And if you have things like data reliability requirements that are really, really high, then at a minimum you should use centralized production, if not centralized production patterns, right, for the rest of the organization to be able to follow so that you can end up with a level of consistency. Now, those are things that you guys have to address. What we can help you with, right, are the tools to actually implement your governance model. So how do we help? So let's talk about a few use cases. So let's take the first one as an example. I want to automatically find and tag PII data, right? So I do have some sensitive data within my organization. I want to be able to find it automatically, and if it's there, I want to be able to write policies to protect it, right? So I can mask that data by using our ABAC beta, which we'll talk about shortly, to either limit the information that's available in a particular column by providing a masking function over it, or by limiting the amount of records that are available for display in that particular table based on a predicate, like a where clause, right? And all this can be done actually based on tags, right? So the cool thing here is you as an administrator can write a policy that is now high leverage, right, to be able to go and automatically find and tag that PII data. So it's pretty cool stuff. And then as users or as the system, right, apply tags on that data, those policies now apply, right? So rather than going and writing a different policy for every single table, right, you write one policy, right? So that's the beauty here. And then you can also apply these tags to assets, right, to be able to aid in your business understanding. So Kristen will go through in her demo, she'll show you what tag policies look like. And you can use tag policies to basically annotate and categorize your assets for consumption, right? So popular examples, right, applying things like domain fields, like indicating that this particular asset is ready for consumption or usage for a particular use case type like machine learning, or that it applies to a particular environment. So these are common themes that we see from customers, right, in being able to apply an additional level of business semantic through tags. And of course, the application of those tags can be themselves controlled, which is pretty cool. So the person that says that this is ML ready is the steward, right, that's responsible for asserting that your data is ready for use in an ML model, as an example. So all of these things are part of like building blocks that make things easier, right? So a few building blocks that we'll talk through. The first is data classification, right, which is the ability in our product, right, to automatically classify and tag data. And I think we support, was it 12, 13?
12 now, but there will be 40 for public preview.
Yep, 40 for public preview for data classification, which is really awesome, like different types of data that we can recognize and tag, and then also tag policies. And as we mentioned, like in the data classification example, the system is sort of responsible for actually applying the tag for you, but also, you can have users who are empowered, right, and granted access to be able to assign those tags themselves. And those tags can be used, right, with attribute-based access control to actually apply at scale now, right, your policies on data, right? So, for example, if I have, in the previous example that I gave, I have a table that had an SSN field in it. I want to write a policy that says organizational-wide, I cannot see SSNs at all unless I'm a member of some super secret admin group. Right? I can write that one policy and put it at the top of a catalog and turn on data classification. And every time data shows up and we detect that it is indeed an SSN, that policy will be applied because a tag will be automatically applied to that data. That's pretty cool stuff, right? So, and then we can make that work by default, right? And if you think about the premise and some of the challenges I was talking about earlier, right? Getting default access or limiting default access, right, really limits the amount of effort that a platform team or a data governance team has to be responsible for when it comes to administering policies. And of course, things always fall outside of this, right? Like there's no world where like you can design your policy infrastructure and your policy definition for your organization, and it's going to be perfect, and you're never going to have anybody that doesn't fall outside of it. And for those cases where customers or users, right, need access to data that's perhaps outside of their immediate purview or outside of their like well-defined role or job function, we have features like request for access, and we'll talk about that in a little bit of detail. Now, the cool thing is, putting all these building blocks together, you have this amazing thing called the Governance Hub, which Kristen I'm very excited. Kristen's going to walk you through what that exactly is, and how we can use the Governance Hub to be able to view and apply data governance across all of our Databricks estate. So, let's go through a couple examples. How did you do this before? Protect all PII data in a catalog. Well, you use column level masks. You applied them on each individual table, one at a time. And that is laborious, right? And the worst part about it is that the low-level admin, like the actual table admin, could always go and apply, or any table admin could go and remove that filter, right? Or go and remove that particular mask. And that means that things like PII could be missed, right? So it leads to compliance gaps, not a good thing, right? Now with tag policies and data classification, you define the rule, you put some permissions on who can use the tags. We can do this across all UC objects now, and we're going to increase the aperture here to also include other objects in the future. And you can use this in things like ABAC, discovery, and cost observability, right? So for example, I can apply a key like sensitivity and give it a list of values, and I have the ability to for that particular tag, assign permissions to users to be able to use that tag. So I could say, hey, Kristen, you're allowed to affect the sensitivity tag and change it to any value that you want. So I could give that as a right to Kristen, and now she can go across the data estate and be the arbiter of sensitivity definitions on data assets. Now, combining that with data classification, right? This is the system now doing it for you, right? We can detect those different types of data and then automatically tag them. And as I mentioned before, discovery, access control, audits, ABAC, all those different use cases for data classification. So for example, if I have a first name field, right, I can automatically tag that as a first name field. If I have an email address field, I can automatically tag that as an email address field. And now those can be used in my policies when writing a particular policy. So if I think about that in an ABAC policy, right, I might want to provide some level of security additional to whatever default grants sort of exist in the system. Say, for example, masking SSNs. Now, With ABAC, you have the attributes side of ABAC, and that provides some context about the assets, the users, the environments. Tags, as I've been mentioning, are a type of attribute. Now, there are other attributes that we have and other attributes that will surface in ABAC as a language over time, but tags are probably the most relevant one for this conversation. So in this case, this SSN column here that you see on the left, this is tagged PII. Now, once you consider that as an attribute that's usable, you can now write a policy that effectively says something like, hey, if this column is tagged PII, then for this column, apply a masking function. And now, of course, this could be applied upstream. So for example, if you as a data owner, as a table owner, you have the ability to manage your table and grants and things on your table, and you can, as a table owner, could potentially override policy that is set on your table without things like attribute-based access control. Now, because of the way inheritance works with attribute-based access control, what you can do as a data governance steward is effectively set a policy at the catalog, right, that will mask all SSN information in that particular catalog, regardless of what the table owner does. So this inheritance, right, is really important because it respects the parent policy, and those policies effectively apply downward. So how does it work all together now? I want to protect this data that's tagged PII in this catalog. With ABAC and data classification automatically finds that PII. ABAC applies that high leverage governance policy. And you have now effective guardrails for safe data usage. And for scenarios where things might fall outside of this, we have RFA, and we'll talk about that in a second. So how did you do this before? I don't know if you guys are me, but I actually love memes, and I find them hilarious. But you want to handle an ad hoc user request to access data. Most customers I talk to, this is like a hilariously complex thing to do. You have to find the table owner, you have to go to a ticketing tool, you have to email somebody, you have to send them a Slack message, you have to ping 3 different people to figure out hey, is this the right owner? Is that the right owner? Am I requesting the right asset? Right? Because it's where you're requesting the asset, right, and where the asset lives are in 2 different places, right? So you're reconciling between multiple systems at a minimum, assuming you have an entitlement request system in your organization, or you're trying to find the right person and hope they're not on vacation, right? These things are complicated, right? And what ends up happening once you kind of find the right person, you get into the right process, then your table owner or your automation creates some policy for you, adds you to a group. Ultimately, it's a high-touch process, and it's painful at most organizations, and you feel like you're kind of running on a treadmill, right? Like our little gerbil here. But with request for access, it's a heck of a lot simpler, right? So you have the ability to do things like grant browse broadly across all catalogs, which allows users to be able to see all the different assets that exist in the catalogs that you've granted browse over. Once you do that, you also set, for any given catalog or any given schema, you can configure RFA as email or Slack destinations, or you can integrate with existing ITSM workflows, so things like Jira or ServiceNow, right? So basically what ends up happening is when the user clicks a button for request access or request permissions in Databricks, either it'll send an email, either it'll send a Slack message to the appropriate owner, or it'll go kick off a workflow in another system to automatically get you into to get you access to the right data set. And the cool thing about this is you don't have to go and reconcile different systems. You don't have to go and find an owner. You don't have to go through some complicated process. The system effectively simplifies that entire journey for you. So in terms of how it works now, right? I want to request access for something that's outside of my predefined policies. I go find my asset. I click a request button. The approver approves it in the appropriate system, or gets an email or notification about it, and permissions are applied. I'm no longer reconciling finding the person. I'm no longer reconciling finding the right asset in the entitlement request system and going through that process outside of that. I simply request the data where it is, and we then kind of go and help you stitch that together and apply those permissions. And of course, the permission application can be done a variety of different ways in our product, whether it's via API, which is what a lot of our customers do, or via some other mechanisms.
Cool, that's me.
That's you.
All right, so we have one more use case I want to cover, and then we can jump into the demo and actually show you some stuff that we pre-recorded. But basically, unlike the 2 examples that Zeashan just mentioned, this one is a little bit high level, I'd say. So basically, we've heard time and time again from different customers that they'll have a data steward or insert equivalent like governance persona. They want to understand how their data is being used, how it's being accessed, who has access to it, and also they might want to know how well documented it is, So are there proper tags? Are there proper robust descriptions to properly describe it? And you can imagine that's just one table. If you're managing 20 tables, even 50 tables, that can get really messy. So I just realized I forgot to show you the current state. So I'll walk through that quickly. So in the current state, kind of summarizing what I just mentioned before, you might jump into an individual table. You might manually review the metadata. So again, those tags, descriptions, other forms of metadata. And then you also might even go into the permissions tab or even the policies tab to review, hey, is there additional fine-grained permissions that are being granted to users to kind of restrict their view?
You click a lot.
Yes, which takes a lot of time, first of all. And then also, you might even want to go look at the lineage graph in the lineage tab and actually see, okay, what downstream pipelines are referencing this table? Are they service principle driven or are these actual humans? That all takes a lot of time and is super manual. So we are trying to introduce what we're calling a data governance hub to start helping you centralize some of these workflows. So today, what I will say, we are targeting a private preview in August. This is, what I'm going to show you is very much our MVP. We want this to be a journey with all of you so that we can make sure we're building the right tools and metrics that are helpful for your workflows. And we know we're not going to get 100% the first time. So again, what I want you guys to take away from this session is this is step 1, and we want to work with all of you to partner on step 2, 3, 4, 10. So basically, there's 3 main goals of this data governance UI. The first being we want to centralize governance tasks. So today we have, again, metadata descriptions, tags, all those assignment flows are within the context of an object. We have our tag policies definitions, which are actually account level. We have metric views, which are all in the dashboard, so you have to go to the workspace file browser. And that's a lot of hopping around, so we really want to consolidate them into a single view so you can have all your features related to managing data governance all in a single place. Second piece, I kind of touched on this a little bit, but basically we want to make sure we're giving you the right metrics, visualizations to help you easily understand how your data is being used, who has access to it, are there data quality spikes or changes that you need to pay attention to, and also what does the metadata look like? Is it actually complete? Do you have certified tables? Things like that. So this is something that we're seriously prioritizing, and we would certainly love your input on things that you think should be here by default, in addition to you being able to customize this view yourself. And then the third bucket is kind of touching on what Zeashan mentioned earlier, automating and enforcing. So we mentioned data classification. I very much see that as step 1 of introducing additional automation and AI-supported flows to help make bulk metadata management a lot easier. Today, we know it's really painful hopping from table to table, even asset to asset, in order to add the consistent metadata. So we want to provide all those tools, and this data governance hub is where those tools will live, so you can monitor them all in one place. Okay, so coming back to that exact same use case, I know it's quite a simple one. Data steward, they want to understand how the data is being used, so basically who's actually using it, what pipelines, et cetera. They want to see who's accessing it, what permissions are in place, and then they also want to see how well documented it is. Rather than having to dig through table to table to table or volume to volume, et cetera, we want to provide a single view for you to get insight into high-level spikes, things that are interesting and you should action on. And we think this model is a better way of looking at it so that you guys aren't spending, 3+ hours going through all these different tables in order to get the exact same information. So that's Governance Hub. I'm going to step over to the computer and kind of walk through a demo. I did pre-record it because it's in our internal environment, and right now it's down, so I'm very happy about that. But here we go. Let's see.
Hazards of being on the cutting edge.
Exactly. I mean, some people will do it well, and it'll be totally fine. So basically, this demo is going to walk through some of the same features that we just mentioned. Here you can see my very slow mouse is finding its way over to the profile page. So here I'm going to click on Settings, and I can go ahead and click on this Data section under Governance. And I can see right now there's a bunch of different usage stats here. So we've got active tables, whether they're registered, what compute requests are querying certain data, and what's the split between them. You can also see things like who are the most active users in popular tables, as well as certain tools such as tag policies, which Zeashan mentioned earlier. So here I can go ahead and search class, and I can see all of these ones that are denoted with this class dot prefix are the ones that are automatically assigned when we identify sensitive information. So again, we're starting with 12. That's going to be 40 soon. Again, here I can go ahead and actually go and view those suggestions and see, okay, now that I have data classification set up in my environment, what tables are getting surfaced and being identified? So here I can see there's name is clearly one of the top classifications being identified. I can see a list of recent activity, and I can actually go in and review some of those classifications. So right now our current model is auto-assigning tags because we'd rather take a secure by default approach. But we want to make sure you can go ahead and review them. So here we can see my tables loading in our dog food environment. And there are 4 different classification tags applied. But because it's a certified table, I want to make sure that people aren't accessing the sensitive data. So here I can see in the sample data tab, first and last name are not masked, so that's not good. However, email and credit card number are. And most of the rest of the information doesn't seem particularly sensitive. So I want to look at the sales org catalog and see what policies are in place at the catalog level. Looking here, I see 3 different policies, none of which are actually related to hiding the name or masking that name. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm walking through here, creating a new policy. And again, I'm going to call that hide name just because I want it to be applicable across multiple tables in the environment. And then here, I'm going to go ahead and select a pre-existing function called hide name. And this is in the governance platform teams folder, so it's very locked down already. And then here, since we already mentioned that class.name was identified, I'm going to reference that as a tag in this condition. So now that I've actually put this policy in place, I need to make sure it's working properly. Clearly, we saw there's a breach in access, and I was able to see first and last name. So that's not good. We want to set these policies by default at the catalog level, so when new data is ingested, we're not running into the same problem. So here, I just buzzed through the sales transactions table, and we could see it was masked. But clicking on this different table within the environment, transactions, I can also see that it has similar sensitive data. So it's first name, last name, email, and credit card number. And I can see that it has all the same masking functions applied accordingly that were impacting that same sales transactions data set. And this really, I think, shows the power of having these automated classifications apply, because then by default, if you have data classification enabled at your catalog level, you can set these policies at the catalog level, and as data is ingested into this specific catalog, you can trust that the data is always going to be identified and protected. And that's really the model that we think works. And in addition to that, it works really well with RFA. So again, you have secure by default, and then in tandem with our RFA feature, your end users can still request access as needed. Okay, so that's kind of the demo portion. Well, I see we have 11 minutes left, so I'm going to go touch on some future thinking just to kind of give you guys insight, maybe spark some Q&A questions. And then next, we can open up for questions. Okay, so this section is fully based on what all of you have told us, actually. So this is based on some of the top requests that we're hearing from customers that are currently using classification ABAC tags. And we really want to highlight them because we see this as some of the future things that we want to prioritize on our roadmap. So the first one that I'm very passionate about myself is controlling access to derivatives. So here we can see, taking that same like sales org example I used before, we have a data steward, Alex. He's responsible for the sales domain. He wants his users to be able to actually use their data, transform it, manipulate it how they see fit, even like do a C task, clone it. But he doesn't want the data being unnecessarily exposed if they're doing transformations and changing the data, moving it to different locations. So today I can give you an example here. We have a very simple masking function based on phone number. Even though it's applied to this business unit catalog level, and even though this transactions data table happens to have this name and phone tag, if a data practitioner happens to clone or transform it, maybe they move it to like a sales prod schema, those tags are not propagating. So what we would recommend today is to enable data classification so that when you do create, transform, and move that data, the sensitive data is always detected and therefore protected. That being said, we recognize that this current problem is quite manual. So as a next step, one thing that we're considering is how to actually support propagating those tags through all these different downstream actions. So as the data moves through your data estate, we want to make sure it's always retaining the metadata. So that includes both tags and then comments. So that's kind of section 1. I have 2 more, and then we can jump into Q&A. So this one's a little bit more complicated, but I think it's a fun one, and I'm curious if you all can relate to it. So today we have a scenario. This one involves 3 different personas. So we have Sarita, who happens to be a data engineer. She's based out of North America, and she needs access to some data that happens to be in the EU. She only really needs access to the North American data for her analysis, but because it's in the EU, she has to work with different data producers like Malik, who really just want to make sure she has all the data that she needs to do her job. That being said, Juan, who's our data steward, wants to make sure that whenever Malik is granting Sarita access to this data, he's doing so in a way that's in accordance to GDPR regulations. So Sarita should only see data pertaining to North America. So today you could solve this actually with our current functionality. So you could create a row filter. You could assign it directly to Sarita. You could also assign it to a group, maybe even like a North American analyst group. So you can do that today, but where the problem arises is if you have multiple different variants of Sarita. So let's say you have 20, maybe even like 100 different variations of the regions or type of access that Sarita and other data practitioners should have access to. That gets kind of hairy and creates a lot of manual work. So one thing that we're exploring, and again, I think we mentioned this last year, but I want to see if people have additional thoughts on this, so please reach out to us after the session. But we are currently planning on exploring using user attributes from your Active Directory, think like Okta, or even if you're using an HR system like Workday, to bring in user attributes related to both individual users like Sarita and then also groups. We see this as a more scalable pattern for handling that previous use case, because rather than having like 20 different variations of the same row filtering policy, you can have a single policy to rule them all. And what that would look like is we could take that user attribute region, for example. We can check what associated values Sarita has with region, and then we can check for a match on that column that happens to be tagged region. So we'll look through the individual values, much like you would with a regular row filter today, and we will actually go and check for whether it's matching her pertaining region. All right, last one for you. So this one's kind of like taking a tangential approach, but we've talked a ton about structured data and protecting structured data and ensuring we have the right access patterns for structured data. But one thing that we are currently looking into right now is how to handle this for unstructured data. So I can give you a pretty similar experience, actually. So Amira, she happens to be a data engineer. She's building an ML pipeline. She needs access to this training file. But Leo, who happens to be the platform owner of this area and this particular volume, he wants her to have access to do her work, but he doesn't necessarily want to give her access to the entire volume. There might be MRI scans or sensitive data in those specific files, and he doesn't necessarily want her to have access to those. Today, we've seen customers solve this by granting access to the entire volume, but only temporarily, so that Amira could go do her work but for a short period of time. Or we've seen them actually copy these files into a new volume in order to share it, which again, super manual, a lot of work. So what we're actually exploring is how to extend grants and denies to support specific file paths. So rather than granting her access on the entire volume, we can grant her access to the images folder. And we see this as a lot more of a scalable pattern. I think you'll notice as we keep growing and developing our governance capabilities, we are trying to be conscious of extending this to non-traditional table formats to make sure we're having consistency for both structured and unstructured data. Okay, so I have 2 slides for you. This is kind of canned. Your learning can continue. We do have additional breakout sessions, instructor-led trainings, and even like self-paced online programs. Also, if you guys like the session, if you liked other sessions you're attending, feel free to fill out the survey. It also is really helpful for giving us insight into what you want to see next year. We're always trying to learn and give you fresh content.